Now, I'm assuming at this point most of you have probably already seen or heard about the trailer for the third season of The Bad Batch, a trailer that overall looked pretty good and has me rather excited for what will be the final season of the show. A show that I've liked for the most part. It certainly has its ups and its downs, or its good episodes and its rather average episodes. But overall, I've enjoyed The Bad Batch, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it ends. The one thing that didn't have me super excited happened at the very end of the trailer, when we heard and then saw the character Asajj Ventress, a character that was actually quite interesting or well done in the Clone Wars animated series. So much so that they even made a book about her called Dark Disciple that was based on some unfinished Clone Wars episodes. And it was a book with a rather sad, yet I'd argue kind of fitting and almost beautiful ending for the character, where, completing a sort of redemption-ish arc she was on in the Clone Wars, she actually ends up giving her life to save and essentially turn back to the light Quinlan Vos, who she had basically fallen in love with through the course of the story. And at the very end of this book, the Jedi even honor her sacrifice by seeing that her body is taken back home to Dathomir, where it's placed in a pool, and it's implied the spirits of her ancestors are kind of welcoming her to the other side. And all in all, as I was just saying, it's a very good story, one of the better ones to come from the, let's call it, extended sources of canon like the books and comics. However, this is Star Wars, and no one is ever really gone, right? Not when there is more content to be had, not when we can use a character again and again to generate perhaps some hype and excitement and to get you to keep watching or to lure you into something you maybe wouldn't have because suddenly now a certain character you love is going to show up in the series. And I mean, if you're Disney and Lucasfilm and those subscription numbers really matter to you, why would you ever worry about story integrity when you feel like you haven't milked a character for all they're worth, when they've still got some mileage or some usage in them yet? It's not like Star Wars takes place in a galaxy, or now 2 galaxies thanks to the Ahsoka series, that has trillions upon trillions of beings, or far more than that probably, living in them and that you can choose from to tell all sorts of stories about or to include in all sorts of different types of stories. Nor is it like arguably the most successful Star Wars story told in the Disney era in terms of, shall we say, kind of fan and general audience appreciation or acceptance or how many people watched it without, complaining about it. It's not like that was the first season of The Mandalorian or anything, a show and a season that featured exclusively brand new characters, and despite its proximity to the Skywalker saga on the timeline, as well as, yes, including the Imperial Remnant, it still felt fresh and new and different, and like it was isolated from everything else that had come before and would come after, and it also had a premise rather new to Star Wars. It also then felt like a story unto itself, rather than just being another piece of content to keep the train chugging along. It felt like it was a story about The Mandalorian and Grogu. And I know many people who hadn't watched or really cared about Star Wars as much before it. I know many people that watched it and loved that show, or at the very least loved Grogu and the father-son relationship that developed between him and Din Djarin, which of course is or was what the show, or what the story, was all about. And honestly, I find that to be a rather impressive feat, one of the most impressive things done with Star Wars in the Disney era, that they made a show that didn't rely too heavily on Star Wars, which sounds kind of ironic or contradictory, that you managed to make something that wasn't totally Star Wars be some of the best Star Wars you've made, that fans and non-fans alike would enjoy. They made a show that happened to be Star Wars that a lot of people loved, which I'd argue was also kind of done with the show Andor, but let's not get into that right now. However, here, and getting back to The Mandalorian, from the Disney Lucasfilm perspective, there's a problem with that. That being, if some of the people watching, maybe even a good percentage of them, if they aren't actually Star Wars fans or becoming Star Wars fans, that they're literally just enjoying the show in and of itself for what it is, well, they then won't necessarily watch other Star Wars content that doesn't have Grogu and or Mando in it. So how do you get them on board with all the other stuff you want them to be on board with so that they stay subscribed to Disney Plus or go to a theater to check out the new movie? And, well, I think this question or Disney dilemma begins to explain why the second season of The Mandalorian started to feel a bit like a cameo fest, with Bo-Katan, Ahsoka, Boba Fett, and Luke Skywalker all showing up. And the interesting thing about 3 of those characters, all of them but Luke, but they'd all go on to either have a series named after them, Ahsoka and Boba Fett, or they'd feature very, very prominently in a series or a season of a show, with Bo-Katan almost taking over the leading role of Mandalorian Season 3. Meaning it turns out those weren't just cameos, they were set up for more content. They were in there to hopefully get Grogu and Mando fans to watch these other shows to come, even going so far as to put Grogu and Mando in the Book of Boba Fett. And not just in there, of course, but they were reunited there, all but forcing fans of those two characters, or fans of The Mandalorian show, to watch that or be completely confused or lost when Season 3 came rolling around. Nevertheless, despite those cameos that would turn out to be more than cameos, most people still really enjoyed the second season of The Mandalorian, and that's probably in large part thanks to Mando and Grogu's story still being the very center or focal point of it all, as well as their very enjoyable story along the way getting a fantastic payoff in the end. As I've said before, not even Luke Skywalker showing up and kicking some butt could ruin the parting of Din and Grogu or be a distraction or take the spotlight away from it. Instead, that parting was ruined in the Book of Boba Fett when they were brought back together, I would argue, way too soon, and in order to get people to watch Season 3 of The Mandalorian, a season where Din and Grogu weren't the core of it anymore, where the story seemed to take a backseat to content necessity, I guess you could kind of call it. Where it almost felt like everything that happened in that season, or most of it, was to further the bigger picture, to facilitate future content generation, more so than be an actual story about characters, especially Din and Grogu, who again took a pretty big backseat. I mean, in the season, we got everything from the strange third episode that was all about Dr. Pershing and showed how the Republic was being undermined by those in the amnesty program, to things like Mandalore being restored rather hastily, it felt like, in some ways, to also having Moff Gideon have this idiotic plan after 2 seasons of being a pretty dang good villain, but he now has this idiotic plan to clone himself and is defeated like a joke, mainly to facilitate the return of Thrawn that we would see in the Ahsoka series. None of these things made for the best possible story in the moment, but it wasn't about that. It was about, again, the content to come, setting up what was going to happen next. And look, I'm not trying to argue against the idea of the shared universe, or to say you can never try to set up a different show, or to introduce a character for a later show down the road in a currently running series. I'm a pretty big fan of the whole idea of the shared universe, or a larger story or narrative always kind of there in the background. I'm certainly not saying you can't plan ahead a little bit and go for a good level of interconnectivity. I just think there's a fine line between going for that and just, again, trying to tell a good story in the moment, or with a series, or with a movie, or whatever. You still need that story in the here and now, and it should always still be good in and of itself, not just a piece of a puzzle. I shouldn't watch a whole season of a show and have to wonder what the story even was in the show, or have it be sacrificed in favor of what comes next being awesome if you just get through this piece. Which is actually a defense I've heard for things like the third season of The Mandalorian, and especially for the first season of Ahsoka. I've heard so many people say they're excited about what's to come next after that ending with the Mortis gods and all of that, but they barely mention what about the season itself, other than maybe saying how cool it was to see Anakin again, or flashbacks to the Clone Wars. They barely mentioned how good the season itself was, because honestly, from my point of view at least, it wasn't a great story. It was rather generic. It was mainly just saying, hold tight and something good will eventually happen. And if I wasn't a fan of Star Wars, I would not have made it all the way through it, because it gave me no reason to care about any of the characters again in that here and now. So why would I stick around for an incredible payoff about characters I don't really care about? And this is all the opposite of something like The Mandalorian, or again Andor did, where I didn't just enjoy them because they were Star Wars or I figured something really cool was going to come next. I enjoyed the journey the characters were on in the moment the most. I enjoyed their story, not the content that would come next because of them. And quickly going back to Ventress being in Season 3 of The Bad Batch, I know they've already said it will align with Dark Disciple somehow, that whatever they're doing with her is, I guess, not going to retcon the book, which then means she's either basically coming back from the dead, or this is going to be a flashback. I suppose it's possibly a flashback. That for some reason the Bad Batch encountered her during the Clone Wars, and we'll be seeing that, and it'll somehow be relevant to everything else going on, and not just a strange one-off episode with her in it because we wanted to have her in it. Anyway, if it is that she's coming back from the dead, not only will that be disappointing because, as we all know at this point, no one ever stays dead in Star Wars, and that's getting pretty annoying, but it'll also mean they couldn't just leave an already good ending to a story alone. They just had to bring her back for reasons, to use her again because it would be cool. And I highly, highly doubt what she'll be brought back for will be anything that profoundly connects to the story of the Bad Batch or what is going on in Season 3 with Omega and Crosshair and so on, and the Clone Rebellion and so on. It's just being done to glamour up their piece of content with a character a lot of people really enjoy, rather than, as I said, leaving what was once a great ending to a character, a terrific story in and of itself, alone. Well, that's going to be all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about this one, about everything I had to say here, or about the apparent return of Asajj Ventress to life in the Bad Batch series. Whatever you think about any of it, though, leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.